Whispers of a forgotten race. For centuries, the Galactic Dominion had ruled the known universe with absolute power, their fleets spreading across countless star systems, their influence shaping the fate of entire civilizations. To them, history was nothing but a tool, a carefully controlled narrative that ensured their dominance remained unchallenged. And so, when they spoke of the past, they chose which truths to keep and which to erase, reshaping reality to fit their needs. One of the greatest erasures in history had been the story of humanity. There had once been whispers, ancient records buried deep within forgotten archives, of a species that had once risen to terrifying heights of power, a race of beings who had stood against the might of the Dominion in an age-long past. But those were just myths, stories told by desperate rebels, and old scholars who still clung to forgotten legends. The official history claimed that humanity had never been more than a minor species, an insignificant group that had destroyed itself before it could ever pose a real threat. And yet, there were those who doubted. There were those who believed that the Dominion had not simply erased humanity's legacy, but had buried something far more dangerous. It began with a simple reconnaissance mission. A small scouting fleet, led by Captain Varish of the Dominion's Outer Rim Patrol, was sent to investigate a series of unusual disturbances along the edges of unexplored space. At first, the crew of Varish's fleet could do nothing but watch in horror as their screens filled with thousands, no, millions, of approaching ships, a war fleet so vast it blotted out the stars. And then the final words came. "We have returned." Before Varish could even react, the Dominion fleet was consumed by fire. And across the galaxy, in the halls of the Dominion's greatest strongholds, in the chambers of those who had ruled for centuries without challenge, in the minds of those who had laughed at the myths of humanity, the same message echoed across the stars. Humanity was not a myth. It was not extinct. It had simply been waiting. The shockwave of the destruction of Captain Varish's fleet rippled across the Galactic Dominion like a wildfire consuming dry fields. At first, the High Command refused to believe it. A fully armed reconnaissance fleet, obliterated within seconds. Impossible. The Dominion had ruled the stars for thousands of years, their technology unmatched, their enemies crushed before they could ever rise. Who could possess such power? Who could have done this? And then the message arrived. It was brief, yet chilling. A single transmission that had traveled through secured military channels, bypassing firewalls, ignoring encryption, reaching the highest echelons of power as if the Dominion's defenses were nothing but glass before a storm. "We have returned." The word sent a deep primal fear through the Dominion's rulers. The myths, the stories they had dismissed as nothing but old legends, were true. Humanity had not perished. They had not been erased. They had been watching. And now, they had chosen to reveal themselves. Not in secrecy, not in diplomacy, but in war. The High Chancellor of the Dominion, a towering four-eyed Excelvari named Lord Kirith Vare, sat in silence as his counselors debated, their voices rising in panic. Some argued that this was a hoax, a psychological attack designed to weaken their resolve. Others insisted that it was a hidden rebel faction, perhaps one that had taken inspiration from human myths. But those who had studied the classified records, those who had seen the forbidden archives, knew the truth. There was no rebellion. There was no deception. It was them. The humans were real. Lord Kirith Vare's clawed hands trembled slightly as he activated a hidden panel on his throne. The room fell silent as the great holographic map of the galaxy flickered to life, displaying the Dominion's vast empire. Star systems blinked in green, indicating strongholds, resource centers, and military installations. The Dominion's fleets were spread across thousands of systems, their warships numbering in the millions. They were the unquestioned rulers of the stars. And yet, something had changed. A red pulse appeared on the map. One at first, then another, and another. 50, 100, 1,000, spreading like a virus across their empire. Systems once deemed secure were now marked as lost contact. The Dominion had faced rebellions before, but never had they seen this. Entire fleets vanishing, communication hubs going dark, outposts that had existed for centuries simply ceasing to respond. How? One of the generals roared, slamming a fist against the table. How is this possible? We would have known if a threat like this existed. There is no fleet in the galaxy large enough to. We were blind, an older counselor whispered, his voice filled with dread. The Dominion has always prided itself on knowing every species, every world, every possible enemy. But we have never been able to track what no longer exists. A heavy silence followed. They were never extinct. Another counselor breathed, his reptilian eyes wide with realization. They were hidden. And then the final horror struck. The Dominion's Grand Fleet, the single greatest military force in the known universe, consisting of over 10,000 warships, led by Supreme Admiral Varkol, had been sent to investigate the loss of Varish's fleet. It was a show of force, a demonstration of the Dominion's might. They had expected to crush whatever resistance lay hidden in the shadows. But now, a new transmission arrived. Live footage. At first, all they saw was darkness. Then, flashes of light. Explosions. Ships breaking apart like fragile glass. And then, through the wreckage, they saw them. The fleet that had no records in history, the warships that had no classification, the weapons that no Dominion scientist could have ever imagined. They did not match the designs of the old human archives. They were something far beyond. They were bigger, faster, stronger. Their hulls bore no insignia, no identifying marks, only the silent darkness of the void itself. The Dominion's Grand Fleet, their pride, their greatest force, was being torn apart like paper in a storm. The transmission ended with a single image, a planet, once thought dead, now glowing with lights. Earth was alive, and it was no longer a graveyard. The High Chancellor stared in horror. This was no rebellion. This was retribution, and the Dominion's greatest mistake was believing the whispers had been just myths. The Galactic Dominion was built on absolute control. It had crushed rebellions, wiped out civilizations, and rewritten history to ensure its rule remained unchallenged. No species had ever risen from extinction to strike back. No enemy had ever returned from the void. But now, the impossible was happening. The High Chancellor, Lord Kirith Ver, sat in his private war chamber, his golden eyes locked onto the holographic display before him. The Grand Fleet, the pride of the Dominion, was gone. 10,000 warships, led by the legendary Supreme Admiral Varkol, had been reduced to wreckage in less than an hour. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. Survivors were few. Those who managed to escape sent only fragments of messages, distorted screams, panicked orders, and sounds of weapons they did not understand. No distress signal had been fully transmitted. The Dominion's greatest fleet had been swallowed by an enemy no one had seen coming. The silence in the war chamber was heavy, filled with unspoken dread. Finally, General Zarkun, a battle-scarred veteran with thick, plated skin, broke the silence. His voice was deep, but there was something in it that had never been there before. Fear. We must face reality, Chancellor. His clawed hand tapped the screen, replaying the last seconds of the Grand Fleet's transmission. This is not the work of rebels, not pirates, not any force we have ever encountered before. The footage flickered. Ships of unknown design moved through the void-like shadows given form, striking with terrifying precision. Their weapons did not fire in the traditional sense. They consumed. Dominion battleships, built to withstand entire planetary sieges, simply vanished in bursts of unnatural energy. And then the final frame, a planet, shining with artificial lights. Earth, a world that was supposed to be a dead rock, wiped clean by the Dominion's purge centuries ago. Yet now it was thriving. This should not be possible, another counselor muttered, his scales paling. We wiped them out. We destroyed their homeworld. There was no way for them to return. Lord Kirith Ver slowly stood, his long ceremonial robe flowing behind him. His hands clenched the edges of the console as his mind worked furiously. The Dominion had not simply wiped out humanity, they had erased them from history. All records of their existence were sealed away, buried beneath layers of secrecy so that no future generation would even question what had happened to them. The Dominion had always known that humans were different, dangerous, unpredictable, unwilling to bow. They had been wiped out for the sake of the galaxy's peace. And yet, here they were, not just surviving, thriving, advancing, fighting back. Kirith Ver's voice was low, controlled, but filled with an underlying rage. How did we not see this? How did they escape our reach? Silence. And then, a chilling realization settled over the war chamber. They never escaped, whispered a shadowed figure, Director Xalveth, head of the Dominion's intelligence division. His kind never showed emotion, but even he looked shaken. They have been hiding. For centuries. The counselors froze. Impossible. One of them snapped. Hiding where? The Dominion controls all known space. Xalveth stepped forward and tapped the holographic display. A section of the galactic map flashed red. Uncharted space, deep within the void, where no Dominion vessel had ever returned from. Here, Xalveth said, the Expanse, the place we never conquered. The place our own ships fear to enter. The Expanse had always been a mystery, a stretch of space so vast, so isolated, that even the Dominion had never been able to fully map it. Some regions were filled with cosmic storms, others with gravitational anomalies, but beyond those barriers, something had been waiting. Something had been preparing. Kirith Ver's eyes narrowed. You're saying the humans have been in the Expanse all this time? Not just hiding, Xalveth corrected. His fingers danced over the console, and the hologram changed, showing strange structures, hidden bases, movement patterns that had long been dismissed as background noise. They have been building. The council chamber fell deathly silent. They let us think they were gone, General Zarkun muttered, his hands clenching. They let us become comfortable, arrogant, blind. Kirith Ver felt a slow, growing horror creep through his veins. The Dominion had believed themselves to be untouchable. Their fleets were the largest in the galaxy. Their technology was centuries ahead of any known species. But the humans had spent centuries in the shadows, studying, adapting, advancing without interference. And now, they had returned. A new transmission flickered onto the screen. Not an attack, not a distress call. A message broadcast across the entire Dominion-controlled galaxy. A voice, calm but resolute, speaking in perfect Dominion standard. To the rulers of the Galactic Dominion, you took our home. You erased our name. You hunted us to extinction. A pause. You failed. And then, the final words that sent an icy dagger of fear through every being in the chamber. The Terran fleet is here. The Dominion had always ruled through fear. It had crushed entire civilizations under its heel, rewritten history to erase any challenge to its supremacy, and silenced all who dared resist. But now, for the first time in centuries, the fear belonged to them. In the war chamber of the High Chancellor's command station, the air was thick with unspoken dread. The holographic display flickered, showing a map of recent human activity, if it could even be called that. Fleet movements, shifting bases, energy signatures that defied known technology. The patterns were unlike anything the Dominion had ever faced. And worst of all, they had been happening for years, right under their noses. High Chancellor Kirith Ver stood at the head of the chamber, his golden eyes locked onto the gathered officials and military leaders. There had been a time when they would have stood tall, confident in the absolute power of the Dominion. But now, they looked shaken, uncertain, afraid. We need immediate action, General Zarkun said, slamming a clawed fist against the metal table. We must assemble all remaining fleets, launch an assault on their hidden strongholds before this threat grows any further. Director Zalveth, the head of intelligence, folded his long fingers together. His species had no facial expressions, but even he seemed unnerved. "We no longer have the element of surprise," he said in a measured tone, "and we have yet to understand the full extent of their capabilities. Rushing into battle without intelligence could be disastrous." "Disastrous," Tsar Kun barked. "We just lost the Grand Fleet. Supreme Admiral Varkol, one of our greatest strategists, is dead. We are at war, and you speak of patience." Kirith Ver raised a hand, silencing them both. His mind was racing. The Dominion had long prided itself on having the most advanced warships, the deadliest weapons, the most disciplined soldiers. But if humans had been rebuilding in secret for centuries, how far had they advanced? "Tell me," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "What do we know about their fleet? Their numbers? Their weapons?" The chamber was silent. Then Zalveth tapped the holographic console, and new data appeared. The image that filled the room made the gathered Dominion leaders stiffen in disbelief. Ships, thousands of them, more than the Dominion had ever predicted. More than any species should have been capable of producing in secret. Some were massive, dwarfing even the largest Dominion warships. Others were sleek, almost predatory in their design. But what sent a chill through the chamber was the energy readings. Unknown power sources, unknown weapon systems, unknown shielding technologies. "We are looking at the impossible," Zalveth admitted. "A species that was supposed to be extinct now possesses a fleet that rivals our own." "No," Kirith Ver whispered, staring at the display. "Not rivals. Superior." The weight of those words settled over the chamber. For centuries, the Dominion had held absolute dominance over the galaxy. Their technology was supposed to be unmatched. Their fleets were supposed to be unbeatable. And yet, here was a species that had been pushed to the brink of extinction, and they had surpassed the Dominion in every way. A low chime interrupted the discussion. A transmission. It was coming from the humans. Kirith Ver clenched his jaw. "Put it through." The hologram shifted. The room darkened, and then the image of a human appeared. He was old, his face lined with experience, his hair streaked with silver. He wore a uniform unlike anything the Dominion had ever seen, simple, functional, yet carrying an air of command. His eyes, however, were what unsettled them the most. Cold, calculating, unforgiving. When he spoke, his voice was calm. "High Chancellor Kirith Ver," he said, addressing the ruler of the Dominion directly. "You do not know me, but I know you." The Dominion leader stiffened. "Your empire has ruled through fear, through genocide. You erased species, destroyed histories, and silenced those who stood against you. You thought you had done the same to us." He leaned forward slightly, and for the first time, Kirith Ver felt something he had never experienced before. Powerlessness. "You failed." The holographic display behind the human changed. It zoomed out, revealing his fleet in full, an armada so vast, so overwhelming, that even the Dominion's greatest fleets paled in comparison. Then the final words that sent a chill through every soul in the chamber. "We are not here for war." A pause. "We are here for justice." The transmission cut out. For a long moment, no one in the war chamber spoke. Then, General Tsar Kun broke the silence. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "We are doomed." The Dominion had always believed itself invincible. For centuries, its fleets had crushed all resistance, reducing entire species to footnotes in history. Civilizations that once thrived were now nothing more than distant echoes, erased from existence as if they had never been. And among those long-forgotten races, the humans had been considered the greatest failure, a species that had dared to challenge the Dominion and been utterly destroyed. At least that was what the Dominion had told itself. But the truth had a way of returning, no matter how deeply it was buried. And now, the truth had returned in the form of a fleet so vast that it made the Dominion's greatest warships look like relics of a forgotten age. High Chancellor Kirith Ver stood in his private chamber, staring at the display before him. The transmission from the humans had ended hours ago, but he had replayed it again and again, trying to find some weakness, some deception. But there was none. The humans had survived. And worse, they had thrived. Their technology was beyond anything the Dominion possessed. Their weapons, their shields, even their energy signatures were unknown. It was as if they had leaped centuries ahead, while the Dominion remained stagnant. The implications were terrifying. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. He turned sharply, his golden eyes narrowing as the chamber doors slid open. General Zarkon entered, his scaled skin tense, his movements stiff with barely contained anger. "High Chancellor," he said, his voice a low growl, "the Dominion is in chaos. Our fleets are in disarray. Our people are afraid." Kirith Ver exhaled slowly. "They should be." Zarkon flinched at those words, his claws flexing against the fabric of his uniform. "You cannot mean that. We are the Dominion. We do not bow to fear." The High Chancellor turned to face him fully. "And yet fear is all I see in your eyes, General." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Zarkon spoke again, his voice quieter now. "What do you intend to do?" Kirith Ver glanced at the display once more, at the thousands upon thousands of human warships positioned just beyond Dominion space. "We must speak with them." The words felt like betrayal on his tongue. The Dominion did not negotiate. It did not plead. It did not submit. And yet here he was, considering the unthinkable. Zarkon recoiled. "You would parley with them?" Kirith Ver's gaze hardened. "If we do not, we may not live long enough to regret it." The general's fists clenched. "We should strike first. We still have fleets. We still have armies. We cannot let them believe we are weak." Kirith Ver let out a short, humorless laugh. "Weak? General, look at that fleet. Look at their technology. Even if we gathered every ship, every soldier, every weapon at our disposal, do you truly believe we would win?" Zarkon hesitated, his breathing heavy. Kirith Ver leaned in, his voice dangerously low. "Do you remember the Grand Fleet?" The general stiffened. The Grand Fleet, the pride of the Dominion, the greatest war armada in history, had been annihilated in minutes. Not in days, not in hours. Minutes. And by what? Not the full might of the human fleet. No, by a single squadron. The weight of that truth settled over Zarkon like a crushing force. Kirith Ver continued, his tone quieter now. "This is not a war we can win, General. If we do not speak with them, we will not have the chance to speak at all." Zarkon's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. After a long moment, he nodded stiffly. "Then let us hope they are merciful." Kirith Ver did not answer, because deep down, he feared that humans had long since lost their mercy. The War Council chamber of the Dominion's High Command had never been this silent before. For millennia, this hall had been filled with the voices of powerful warlords, strategists, and rulers, all of them making decisions that shaped the fate of entire civilizations. Yet now, as High Chancellor Kirith Ver stood before his assembled generals, admirals, and advisors, not a single one dared to speak. A holographic projection loomed over the vast chamber, displaying the human fleet in full detail. Ships larger than any Dominion dreadnought. Weapons beyond anything their scientists had ever conceived. Shields that seemed to bend reality itself. And then there was the transmission. The humans had spoken. Not in threats, not in boasts, but in facts. "We are not here for war, but we do not fear it." A simple statement, yet one that carried immeasurable weight. They did not fear war, because they had already won. Kirith Ver let the silence stretch, watching his war council carefully. They were terrified. Admiral Silentor, one of the most decorated tacticians in the Dominion, sat motionless, his reptilian fingers twitching against the metal table. General Zarkun, who had once demanded immediate retaliation, now remained rigid, his throat muscles tightening every few seconds, a clear sign of stress among his species. Even Grand Strategist Orvin, a being whose very name was synonymous with military genius, refused to meet the High Chancellor's gaze. Kirith Ver exhaled slowly. "The humans have presented us with a choice," he said at last. His voice, though calm, carried a weight that pressed down on every soul in the room. "Surrender or be erased." Silentor's voice cracked as he finally spoke. "We must fight." Kirith Ver raised a brow. "Fight." The Admiral swallowed hard. "We have survived countless wars. We have conquered empires. We have bent the laws of the galaxy to our will. We cannot win this war." Kirith Ver interrupted, his tone sharp. Silence fell once more. The High Chancellor stepped forward, eyes scanning the faces of his war council. The Grand Fleet was obliterated by a handful of human ships. Our greatest weapons were reduced to nothing in seconds. Do you truly believe that throwing more ships at them will change anything? No one answered. "No," he continued, his voice quiet but unwavering. "We will not fight them, because there will be no war. There will be no battle. There will only be our destruction." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. General Zarkun clenched his fists. "Then what do you suggest, High Chancellor? That we bow to them? That we become their slaves?" Kirith Ver shook his head. "No, I suggest we listen." A murmur rippled through the chamber, a mixture of unease and disbelief. "Listen," Orvin scoffed, his voice hoarse. "You would have us submit to the very creatures we erased from history." Kirith Ver's golden eyes darkened. "We did not erase them." Every head turned toward him in confusion. The High Chancellor inhaled deeply before speaking again. "We thought we had destroyed them. We believed them to be gone. But they were not. They survived. And not just survived. They thrived." A holographic display shifted, now showing the human colonies. Vast worlds, bustling space stations, and thriving civilizations that stretched far beyond the reaches of Dominion space. While we basked in our own arrogance, Kirith Ver continued, they were building something greater than we ever imagined. A cold realization settled over the room. The Dominion had grown complacent. They had assumed themselves to be the pinnacle of power. But while they remained stagnant, the humans had advanced far beyond them. Admiral Silentor exhaled shakily. "Then what do we do?" Kirith Ver looked at the looming projection of the human fleet. "We make contact." The room exploded with voices. "This is madness. You would give them the Dominion without a fight. They will never let us live. They will slaughter us all." Kirith Ver raised a hand, and the voices fell silent once more. "They have not come to exterminate us," he said firmly. "If that was their goal, we would already be dead." That simple truth cut through the room like a blade. If the humans had wanted revenge, they wouldn't have sent a transmission. If they had wanted blood, they wouldn't have given the Dominion time to respond. Zarkun hesitated, then slowly asked, "And if they demand our surrender?" Kirith Ver's gaze hardened. "Then we bargain." Another stunned silence followed. The High Chancellor turned toward the communication console, his fingers hovering over the controls. The decision had already been made. The Dominion would either adapt or be forgotten. The moment had arrived. For centuries, the Dominion had ruled the galaxy unchallenged. They had conquered. They had eradicated threats. They had rewritten history to erase species they deemed unworthy. And yet, here they stood, facing the ghosts of a past they had tried to erase. High Chancellor Kirith Ver's fingers trembled slightly as he activated the Dominion's grand communication array. The humans were waiting. Their fleet, massive and motionless, filled the horizon like an unstoppable force of nature. The entire War Council chamber held its breath. The holographic interface flickered, then stabilized, revealing the face of the human commander. He was unlike anything the Dominion had expected. They had envisioned a monster, something cruel, vengeful, dripping with fury. They had assumed that any race capable of such destruction would be filled with hate. But the man before them was calm. His eyes were sharp, but there was no rage in them. His posture was strong, but he did not move with arrogance. And when he spoke, his voice was measured and firm. "I am Admiral Jonathan Kane of the Terran Vanguard. I speak on behalf of the United Human Federation." A pause. Then he continued, "You know who we are." Not a question, a statement. A chill ran through the room. The Dominion's top strategists, warriors, and leaders, all paralyzed in silence, because they did know. For years, whispers of humanity had been dismissed as superstition. Their existence had been reduced to fragments of history, nothing more than fairy tales to scare young Dominion children. And yet here they were. Real, unstoppable, unforgiving. Kirith Ver took a slow breath before speaking. His voice was steady, but everyone could hear the weight behind his words. "We acknowledge your presence, Admiral Kane." A subtle flicker of amusement crossed the human's face. "Acknowledgement," Kane repeated, as if testing the word. "Is that what you call it?" The High Chancellor didn't answer, because what could he say? The Dominion had spent centuries denying the existence of humanity. Now, with their fleet towering above, there was no more denying the truth. "We were told your kind was destroyed," Kirith Ver finally said. Kane's gaze darkened. "You were told wrong." Silence. No one in the chamber dared to speak. Kane leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. Then he said the words that shattered the Dominion's illusion of control. "The question is, what happens next?" Every Dominion official stiffened, because they didn't have an answer. For the first time in their history, the Dominion was not in control, and the humans knew it. Kirith Ver chose his next words carefully. "What do you want?" Admiral Kane studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. "Justice." The word hung in the air, thick with meaning. The War Council shifted uncomfortably. Justice, a simple word, but when spoken by a species that had been wiped from history, it carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. "You call it justice," Kirith Ver said carefully. "Others might call it vengeance." Kane's expression did not change. "If we wanted vengeance, we would not be speaking right now." Kirith Ver exhaled slowly. The meaning was clear. The human fleet could have destroyed them already. If they had wanted the Dominion's extinction, there would be no negotiations. And yet they had come not as conquerors, but as something far more terrifying. "As judges." "Then tell me, Admiral," Kirith Ver said quietly. "What is your judgment?" Kane tilted his head slightly. "That depends on you." Another heavy silence. Every eye in the chamber was on Kirith Ver. Every breath was held. Because the fate of the Dominion now rested in a single decision. Surrender, or resist, and be erased. The High Chancellor straightened his posture. His entire life had been dedicated to ruling an empire that he believed could not be challenged. And yet, humanity had returned, not as broken remnants, but as a force beyond anything the Dominion could comprehend. "We will stand down," Kirith Ver said at last. Shock rippled through the chamber. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to say. Admiral Kane nodded, his expression unreadable. Wise choice. The transmission ended, and for the first time in Dominion history, the War Council chamber was filled not with strategy or debate, but with the deafening realization that their empire, their way of life, had changed forever.